Some molecules have a fluorescence property, which means when they are stimulated by a light of shorter wavelength, they emit a longer wavelength light, which makes the molecules glow. We use an orange color dye of sodium fluorescein injected in a peripheral vein to reach the eye circulation. This dye absorbs blue light and emits a longer wavelength green light. We use two filters to capture the final image. An excitation filter of cobalt blue allows only for blue light with wavelength of about 490 nanometers to pass through, so only this light reaches the retina and choroidal vessels and tissues that are already injected with the dye. This dye will then emit a yellow-green light of 530 nanometers wavelength, in addition to the reflected blue light. The barrier filter is used to absorb the reflected blue light, allowing only for the yellow-green light to pass through. Eventually, this light is captured as the final image. But what happens in the eye circulation?
You see, when the dye reaches the ophthalmic artery, it passes through its two ocular branches, the central retinal artery and the posterior ciliary artery. Although the central retinal artery branches off first from the ophthalmic artery, the dye reaches the choroidal vessels first, through the short posterior ciliary arteries, because it does not depend on the anatomical order but rather on the hemodynamic properties of the two vascular systems. The choroid lights up first, not because of anatomy, but because its low resistance, high flow, leaky vessels allow faster dye delivery and extravasation compared to the retina.
The dye reaches the choroidal vessels and capillaries after 11 seconds of injection. Filling up the choroid with fluorescence gives it a patchy lobular appearance, which becomes flush due to diffuse filling. The dye actually cannot leak out of the choroidal vessels in the Sattler and Haller layers, which contain normal unfenestrated vessels, but it can diffuse from the fenestrated choriocapillaris.
Keep in mind that the dye cannot diffuse through the outer blood-retinal barrier, which means it cannot pass from the choroid through the retinal pigment epithelium layer to the retina.
The dye also cannot pass through the inner blood-retinal barrier, which means it cannot diffuse through the retinal capillaries. This phase is called the choroidal phase. But why does the macula in this phase appear dark? You see, the RP cells in the macula are bigger and taller and contain more melanin and xanthophyll. This pigment blocks the choroidal fluorescence during this phase. The retinal vessels will appear dark in this phase because the dye has not reached the retinal circulation yet. When the dye reaches the central retinal artery, the arterial phase starts, and usually after 1 second of the onset of the choroidal phase. The veins in this phase are still dark. 1 second after, the arteriovenous phase starts. When the veins start to fill with the dye, it flows near the vessel's wall at first in a laminar flow pattern. Then, when veins are filled with dye, the late arteriovenous phase starts.
The arteriovenous phase starts about 14 seconds after injection, and it reaches the late arteriovenous phase after about 20 seconds of injection. So the arteriovenous phase takes about 8 to 10 seconds to complete. Late arteriovenous phase is also called the venous phase, and it is the best phase to visualize the perifoveal capillaries. The dye then will re-enter the same circulation over and over with dilution of the fluorescence until it completely disappears from the eye circulation after 10 minutes of injection. This phase is called the recirculation phase.